This is a Pages ECN webinar. The Pages Early Career Network has started in 2018. Since then we have grown to almost 500 members and we're still rapidly growing. A new feature of Pages ECN is the forming of clusters. Such is the webinar cluster. This is the first webinar organized by the webinar cluster rather than the steering committee. And in the future, if anyone has nice ideas for topics for webinars, you are very welcome to contact Pages ECN webinar cluster with your ideas. For our next Pages ECN webinar, we are very happy to welcome Professor Tierre Correge. He is the editor of the scientific peer review magazine Palaeogeography, Paleaeoclimatology, and Paleaeocology. Paleocube publishes articles in the field of paleoenvironmental geology, with Paleaeoclimatology included. Professor Correge has been the editor of Paleocube for 15 years, and his specialities are Cenozoic and Quaternary Paleoclimatology, Palaeoceanography, and Paleaeocology of aquatic organisms. Next to editor of Paleocube, Professor Correge is adjunct director of EPOC, the Oceanic and Continental Environments and Paleoenvironments, which is an institute that is connected with the University of Bordeaux, where Professor Correge received his professorship in Paleaeoclimatology in 2006, and the French National Center for Scientific Research. Within Pages, Professor Correge has been active in the arts program, the Annual Records of Tropical Systems. Today, Professor Correge will give us a presentation on the topic how to successfully publish a scientific paper. I want to thank you for making a time for this webinar, and now I would like to give the word to Professor Correge.
Thank you, Nick. Welcome, everybody. And so I will give a presentation which will last 25 to 30 minutes, and then I will answer all your questions. There were quite a lot of questions this morning, so we'll see how we go this afternoon. Afternoon for me and probably morning for you, some of you. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to first give you a brief history of scientific publication, how it started, and you will see that it has changed, but not that much. I'll talk briefly about my own journal, my work as an editor, and a few words about peer reviewing, which is a very important topic for me. And then we'll talk about how to prepare a good manuscript. So what should it contain, how to write it, and then I'll finish with some useful tips to enhance your chance to be published. So let's start with the publishing industry. And this is a time scale. It starts in 1580 because it's the year Elsevier, my publisher, was created. And this is a slide that Elsevier gave to me a few years ago. The first important date for scientists is actually 1665. In January of that year, French scientists created Le Journal des Savants, which is the first ever scientific journal in Europe. And then 3 months later, Philosophical Transactions was created in England by Henry Oldenburg. And then the following years, there were some scientific journals created in Italy and in Germany, and so it was the beginning of the scientific journals. And then it didn't change that much until 1989, when Tim Berners-Lee started to work on the World Wide Web and created a revolution. And then 10 years later, Google appeared and blogs appeared, and then in the past 20 years we've seen a huge amount of new ways to communicate science. You have a few there, but it's been really changing a lot the way we treat science and we deal with science. To give you an idea, when I started as an editor 15 years ago, nothing was electronic. I was receiving paper copies of articles when they were submitted, and I had to write all my comments on the paper copy and send it to the authors, and the reviewers would do the same. Now it's completely automatic and it's completely done on the web. There's no more paper. I won't talk about this because you can't see the. We have a problem with some figures. It's just to tell you that in the recent years, there's been an increase in the number of journals. Roughly since it started in 1665, there's been a 3% increase per year. And now we got more than 2,000 journals published each year and 1.5 million articles published each year. So it's a lot. And of course, it gives you more chance to get published because you have more journals available, but there's also quite hard competition, and depending on the journals, 30 to 60% of the papers are rejected. So you have to be aware of that. Okay, so what's the role of a publisher? Basically, you have 4 pillars, which is first one is the registration. So it's a timestamp to when you submit your paper to say that you were the first one to submit it, and it's your idea, and so you register your ideas. Certification is the peer review. So colleagues from the same field will ensure about the validity and integrity of your work. And then when it's accepted, the publisher has to disseminate, so distribute your paper, provide a medium for your paper to be disseminated. And then the 4th pillar is preservation over time. And so your article, once published, will be preserved for posterity. And those 4 pillars, they're not new because they were introduced in 1665 by Henry Oldenburg, this guy. So it's still the same. We have changed a little bit the way we do, so, for example, preservation or dissemination. In 1665, it was preserved on books. Now it's all electronic, but basically the 4 pillars are still the same. Okay, now to my journal, briefly, it's we call it Paleocube or Paleo3. We never put the long title, it's too long. We receive almost 800 papers per year, submissions, and at the moment we have 5 editors. We used to be 4, and when I retire at the end of the year, they probably will take 2 people to replace me, so there will be 6 editors. We receive so 800 submissions per year, and we have about acceptance rate of between 40 and 60%, depending on the year and depending on the editors. So it means that around 400 papers are published each year, 5,000 pages. And between the time you submit your paper and the time it will be in print, it's about 26 weeks, half a year. We're trying to cut down this time. It's already been cut a lot with the electronic submissions, but we're still working on it. And one of the problem, so this is, it's not going to work. Okay, so I had some figures here telling you that when you submit a paper, it comes to me. If you submit it to my journal, for example, I will get the paper. I will check if it's okay. If it's not okay, if I don't think it's good, I will reject it straight away. And then if it's good enough, I will send it to reviewers. They will send me the review, and then based on those reviews, I will accept or reject the paper. I will accept it with minor to major revision, and then I send the paper back to you. You correct it. You send it back to me. I check it again. Sometimes I ask the reviewers to have a second look at it, at the revised version. And then after it goes to, if it's accepted, it will go to production. You will receive the proofs and so on. So it takes half a year on average. Sometimes it gets longer, sometimes shorter, but on average, it's half a year. And one of the major issue with the time it takes is peer reviewing. So I think you probably all know peer reviewing. It's the process of submitting your work to the scrutiny of others who are also experts in the same field as you. And then this peer reviewing was introduced quite early in 1665 by Henry Oldenburg. But it was essentially carried out by editors until the mid 20th century. And it's very recent that we send the paper to colleagues. And just to show you a funny example, in 1936, this is a letter sent to the editor-in-chief of the Physical Review. We, Mr. Rosen and I, had sent you our manuscript for publication and had not authorized you to show it to specialists before it is printed. I see no reason to address the, in any case, erroneous comments of your anonymous expert. On the basis of this incident, I prefer to publish the paper elsewhere. Respectfully, and this is signed, oops, sorry, I did a mistake. Nick, can you help me? Sorry, I might be able to get back to my...
Is mine screen? Can you click on share my screen?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna be able to get back to it. Oh boy. Sorry, everyone.
Upload in progress, all right. It's uploading, so it should be okay. Gives you time, all the people who are listening, to think about who could be the... Could have been. Yes.
I've written this letter to the editor. It's a small scientist. Okay, sorry about that. So we're back. Okay, and this is the answer. It's Einstein who wrote this. So you can see that even very famous scientists were against peer review in their early days, actually, because Einstein, this paper, he kept it for a few years, and then a few years later, he took it back and he realized he made a mistake, and the mistake he made was the one that the reviewers had picked up. So he could have published his paper much earlier with corrections if he had accepted the fact that peer review was useful. So we all show that peer review is very useful now. The problem is how to do it, and a lot of people refuse now to review paper. They say, I'm too busy, and so on. So you have the different ways to do peer review. You can do a single blind peer review. So you receive a paper to review. You know who the author is, and then you don't want to, you want to remain anonymous. So it's the authors of the paper will not know who reviewed the paper. And then you have double-blind peer review, where you receive a paper to review, you don't know who the authors are, and then you do your review, and the author won't know who you are. Open peer review, that's usually what I do myself, that when I review a paper, I always give my name. The author, you know who the authors are, and then the authors know who you are as a reviewer. Post-publication review is not very frequent. You publish the paper, and then after you have reviews. So I insist about peer review because it's very important. When you have to realize that when you submit a paper, this paper will need to be reviewed. It's the system at the present, and it might change in the future, but at present, when you submit a paper, you will generate 2 reviewers, and so you owe 2 reviews to the community. So if you think, okay, I'm not going to accept reviews because it takes too much time and so on, it's not a good attitude. And it's very interesting to look at other papers anyway. Okay, so how to write a good MS manuscript? I'm not a miracle person. I won't give you any miracle recipe. I'm not a wizard, but there are things you should do to enhance your chance to be published, for sure. I have, for the rest of my presentation, I asked a colleague, Angel Borja, who works in the Basque Country in Spain, and who is editor of several journals. I asked him to give me some of these slides because he wrote several papers about how to successfully write a scientific article, and he gives lectures about that. So some of the slides that you will see in the next few minutes are from his work. I changed some of them, but they owe a lot to his work. So what is a good manuscript, first of all? Well, it's a manuscript that contains a scientific message that is clear, useful, and exciting for the community, for the scientific community. It's a manuscript that will convey your thoughts in a logical manner, such as the reader arrives at the same conclusion as the author. That might seem trivial, but it's not always the case. And very often I read papers and I think, oh, what the hell? What do they mean? What do they want to prove? I can't understand. So if I cannot arrive easily to the same conclusion as the author, it's no good. The MS should be constructed in a format that best showcases your material and written in a style that will transmit a clear message. So try to be as clear as possible and straight to the point. And basically, a good MS tells a story. So if you have a good story to tell, you can write a good manuscript. If you just have data and you don't know what to do with your data, chances are you won't get published, because if you don't have a story to tell with your data, people will ask you, why did you get those data in the first place? Okay, so now we'll see how to prepare a good MS. So the construction first. Most of the articles follow the IMRAD structure or format. What does it mean? It means that you have an introduction. What did you do? What did others do? Why did you do it? Methods. How did you do it? Results. What did you find? And discussion. What does it all mean? What's your story? How does your result compare to others, and so on? So this structure is very common, except in specific journals like Nature or Science, where you have to take another format. But in most articles that you will have to write, you will follow this structure. Okay, so what should you put in the introduction, for example? You have to convince the readers firsthand that your work is useful, that you've done something interesting. So first thing you have to do is think about what you want to show. What is the scientific rationale of your work? Why is it important? What's the state of the art? What are you bringing in terms of novelty? All these kind of questions, you have to put that in the introduction. Very often I refuse papers because they don't have a scientific rationale. People say, oh, I've analyzed the core and I've got pollens in the core, for example, or forams or whatever. Yeah, what for? Why did you do it? And then editors like to see that you provide a perspective which is consistent with the scope of the journal. Why did you choose the journal? Let's say that you want to publish in my journal. We have a scope. If you're completely outside the scope of the journal, I would say, okay, why did they choose this journal? So make sure that you cite important work, recent review articles if you can, that are consistent with the scope of the journal you chose. Editors don't really like improper citation, too many references that are irrelevant to the work. Try to really pick up the good references. I'll tell about how many you should have later on. And then it's okay to cite previous work, your previous work, but don't go overboard with that. I guess the audience is young scientists, so it shouldn't be the case. But some older scientists, they only cite their work, so that's not good. And especially, you shouldn't be afraid to introduce a controversy. if your work does not agree with previously published data. And it's actually very important to cite data in disagreement with yours. If you don't cite the people who don't agree with you, it means that you don't know the literature, and so it's no good for you to. Okay, in the method, what you should put in the method is how the problem was studied. And so if you introduce a new method, or new methods, if you have several, you need to really put the detailed information about the method so that people can reproduce your experiments. If people cannot reproduce what you've done, then they will say, okay, this is weird, and they'll have doubts, and the paper will not be accepted. If the method you use are already published elsewhere, if it's if you measure stable isotopes in forums, well, no point in putting 3 pages about that. You can have supporting material, or you can just give some key references. That's enough. So make sure you completely describe your method, especially if it's new. And if it's not new, really say exactly which method you use, because very often reviewers will criticize a paper when the methods are incomplete, and they will recommend rejection. And then this is the Pages community, so a lot of people work on cores. So make sure you present the age model in a clear way. And if it's applicable, if you have an age model, it's another big cause for rejection. Very often, if your age model is not good enough, people will say, okay, the data are useless if we don't have a good age model. So first hand, make sure you have a good age model and you present it well. The results section now. What have you found? Well, you have to tell the people what have you found. You should present representative results. You know that results you present, usually you present them in form of figures or table, and what you present should be discussed then in the discussion, and they should be essential for the discussion. If you have data that are not so important, secondary importance, you can present them in supporting material. If you have a set of a good data set, don't try to keep data or hide data for later on. You may keep the data that are very important, and the reviewers will pick up that, and they will not accept your paper because they'll say, okay, we need more data. So if you have a data set, publish it as a whole. And then to present the results, you have to use subheadings to keep the results in the same type together. It's easier to review, it's easier to read, so number your subsections and try to decide on a logical order to present your data and your results. And you should tell something which is clear and easy to understand and to follow. Usually in the results section, you should not include references. And of course, you never discuss results in the results section. You keep that for the discussion. And very important, especially nowadays, it's very important that you make it clear that the data are available somewhere. It can be stored on the Paleaeoclimatology page of NOAA or in Pangea or in the journal. Some journals offer to host the data, but you have to make it clear that the data are available for people to use them. That's very important too. Discussion now. Discussion. Well, it's the easiest section to write, but the hardest to get right, according to Martin Welsh. She's a seasoned author and editor. And it's true. This is where you sell your stuff, and this is where most editor will have a good look and decide if they accept or reject your paper. So a huge number of MS are rejected because the discussion is too weak. So take time and write a good discussion. In the discussion, you should discuss the results and put them in perspective, but you should not repeat them, of course, because they are already in the results section. And of course, you need to compare what you've done with other results previously published. Some are reference results, like iScore data or the stack, the deep sea stack for benthic forams or whatever. So you really need to compare your data, and especially do not ignore work which is in disagreement with yours. Science is about confronting ideas, so you have to discuss why your results are different and try to bring forward some explanation. And it's also good in the discussion section to have a summary figures where your results will be compared to others. As I said, it can be compared to iScore data, whatever, some reference curves that are in your field, and you show how your result compared to those well-established data. Okay, the reference list now. You should not go overboard. You have to read the guide to authors, but most papers will accept 30 to 50 references. I received a paper the other day. The reference list was twice as long as the article itself. I rejected it and I said, okay, cut down the number of references and then we'll see. Remember to cite papers in journals from related fields, because if all the papers you cite are from journals that are, for example, if you submit to my paper, to my journal, and if I don't know any of the journals you cite, I will say, oh, this is not my field, I don't understand, so this is not the good paper for my journal. And it's also, if you want to publish in an international journal, it's important to show with the references that your work can reach an international audience. If you want to publish a paper on an outcrop in, let's say, Central Asia, and all the references you have are from authors that work in this region, and only, and maybe not even in English, then you won't reach, you will not reach a wide audience, and your paper will be better suited for a local journal. It's not, the quality of the paper is not discussed here. It's just the fact that if you want to reach an international audience, then your paper has to have international appeal. It's the same if you want to publish a taxonomy, for example, you have to choose a specialized journal, not a broad journal like Paleaeoclimatolgy, for example. Okay, a few good advices from my colleague Angel. So he wrote this paper. You can go to this, I put the website down there, and he's got very good advices how to organize your manuscript. So basically, it's 11 steps. First, you start by preparing the figures and the table. Make good figures, good tables, if you need tables. But figures are very important. And then you start writing the methods and the results. So that's easy. You start with that. And then you write the discussion. Then you shouldn't think, okay, I'm going to write the introduction first, and then I'll write the rest of the paper. First, you write the discussion, and if you get the results and the discussion right, then you will be able to write a good introduction. And then you finish with the conclusion. I mean, you write the conclusion, a clear conclusion, and then you write a compelling introduction. And this is where you're going to really look at the state of the art, look at your scientific rationale, and because you have already written the discussion, you have a clear idea of what you should put in the introduction. Then the abstract, very important too. You should have all the keywords. Keywords will come later. Try to find also a good title. This comes almost last. You put the title and you choose a good title that will reflect what's in your MS. and then acknowledgements and references. Okay, the style. If English is not your mother language, write with short sentences. In some languages, like my language, French, we often write with very long sentences, but when I write in English, it's one subject, one verb, one complement, that's it. Short, straight to the point, that's the best way to be clear. If you're not a native English speaker and you have co-authors who are, make sure they write, they read the paper and they contribute to the writing. Editors are really put off by papers who arrive with a co-author from England or the United States, Canada, Australia, whatever. And if the English is really bad, it means that those co-authors haven't read the paper. So it's bad because either it means that they were too busy and they didn't care, or the first author didn't even bother to contact them and they just put them as co-authors without, and they haven't seen the paper. So both cases are bad. So make sure they read the paper. And then you should divide the paper in paragraphs. So paragraphs, this is how to write paragraphs, especially for the introduction and discussion section. So the most effective way to communicate is to develop only a single idea for each paragraph. And then each paragraph should start with a simple sentence and a key idea, which will give the paragraph it's called the topic sentence, and it will give the idea for the paragraph. Okay, and then the remainder of the paragraph you can write longer sentences, even though I said don't put too long sentences. But then you can write 3 to 10 sentences where you will elaborate on this key idea. You will talk about data interpretation. You will cite literature. And so you will develop a logical argument to support the first sentence, the key idea. If you write paragraphs with only 1 or 2 sentences, this is poor writing style, and editors don't like that. So it's no good to have short paragraphs. Try to have paragraphs with key ideas and 3, 4, 5 to 10 sentences. Okay. And so to wrap up this presentation, I have some key messages. If you want to submit a paper, you should be sure that you're proud of your work and you've polished the work. Don't expect the reviewers to finish or polish your work, or the editors. If I receive a paper which is not good enough and I see that it's been done very quickly, I send it back, I reject it. So you have to send the paper when you're really proud of what you've done and you think, okay, I've done my best. Now I know that the reviewers will have remarks and they'll improve my paper, but I've done the best. Now it's time to send it. Carefully read the scope and instruction to authors, of course, for the journal you choose. It's important. Be aware of some journals' peculiarities. Some journals will ask you to, they will put your paper, for example, online, and then it will get a number, DOI, and then people will look at the paper. It will be as if it was published, but then it will be reviewed, maybe rejected. And then you'll be left with a paper which is online, but it's not accepted. It's just a discussion paper. So think about that before you send to some journals, or at least be aware of that. Be honest with in your choice of reviewers. There's no point in if you ask to provide reviewers, don't put your supervisor, if you're doing now a postdoc or whatever, or your friends that you met at a conference. You have to be honest and try to use people, provide people who are good in your field, but not people who are close to you. Remember that every time you submit a paper, I already said that you owe 2 reviews to the community, so accept reviewers. When you ask by editors to review papers, accept it. It's interesting. It's a great job. If the paper is rejected, doesn't mean that it's bad. Sometimes good papers get rejected. A few years ago, I had paper that I thought was good. And Science was publishing more paleo papers than Nature, so we sent it to Science, and it was rejected without being sent to reviewers. So my co-authors, who were Australian and Americans, they told me, okay, we're going to send that to geophysical research letters. And I thought the paper was really good, so I sent it to Nature, and it was accepted in Nature. So it was rejected by Science, but still it was a good paper because it was accepted elsewhere in another good journal. So don't think it's bad, but if your paper is rejected, there are two important things. The first thing is that if it's rejected with reviews, use the reviews to enhance, to improve the paper, because sometimes people just send it's rejected with reviews, and people just send it to another journal without doing anything. And chances are you might get the same reviewers, and that's really bad because then your paper is blacklisted. So if you have reviews, use them, improve your paper, and then you can send it to another journal saying that it was rejected, and you can provide the reviews and say, okay, I've done all this this improvement and so on. The editors usually like that. And if the paper is rejected, except if you can really prove that the reviews are biased, there's no point arguing with the editor. Sometimes I get people say, oh, my paper was rejected, but it's a really good paper. You should send it to other reviewers and so on. I said, no, if it's rejected, it's rejected. We receive too many papers. We cannot spend our time reviewing again and again and again the same paper. Okay, so I've finished my presentation, and now I'm open to questions.
Raise your hand figuratively, and then we can turn on your sound, or you can type in your question on the right Q&A section.
Okay, thank you very much for your very nice presentation. So far, no questions from you, Mats. Okay. Any questions from other people? Okay, I have a question from Nick. Does it happen often that a rejected MS is accepted in the end? You mean in my own journal, or you? There are two types actually of rejection. Sometimes I reject papers and it's finished, so the people can send the paper elsewhere. And sometimes I see paper that I've rejected published in other journals. And sometimes I reject the paper, but I leave the door open. And I tell the authors, okay, I reject your papers because there are serious issues. So you have, sometimes they have additional data to show or other things to do. And I tell them, if you wish to resubmit your paper, then I will consider it again. I will probably send it to the same reviewers that rejected it. So you really have to improve the paper and answer all the queries. And so it can happen, and sometimes it happened that I rejected the paper, but I left the door open, and then the paper came back much better, and it was accepted in the end. So it can happen. But rejection, I mean, everybody has had a paper rejected once. There's roughly a 50% chance of your paper to be rejected in most journals. If you submit to Nature or Science, you've got an 8% chance to be accepted. So 92% chance of being rejected. So everybody will have a rejection once, at least once, probably more than once. It's part of the process. When is the right moment in a career to accept an invitation to review a paper? Well, straight from the start. I mean, as soon as you start a PhD, if you start a PhD, the first thing you're going to do is look at the literature, basically. And so by looking at the literature, you become very quickly an expert in your field. And so I have very often I send papers or I ask colleagues to review a paper, And they tell me, sorry, I don't have time right now, but I have a PhD student who just started his PhD or her PhD or who is in the second year. And can I give him the paper to review? And I said, yeah, of course, it's important. I reviewed my first paper and I was not even doing my PhD, that was just before. So I think as early as you can. And it's very formative for the people to review papers because you will realize what's good, what's not good in a paper, and then it will help you write better papers. Let's see a question coming up. Is there any way the author of the MS to help speed up the review process? Not really, actually. The best way, if you want to speed up the review process, is to provide, if you ask to provide potential reviewers, try to provide good potential reviewers, which means that they're not all from your country. They're not friend of yours, or when I receive a paper, I check the reviewers. I check if the authors have published with the potential reviewers. If it's the case, it means that I won't ask them. So it's a waste of time. So if you, it means that I will spend more time looking for other potential reviewers. And so if you provide good reviewers, I will look at them and will say, okay, these guys look all right. So I will ask them, and that can speed up the process. But otherwise, there's nothing that the author can do. And then, how many review invitations should we accept for a year? Is too much invitations? Well, it's really, I guess, it's really up to you. What I would say is that you have to keep in mind, as I said, that every time you submit a paper, you generate 2 or 3 reviews. So you owe, the first author at least, owes 2 or 3 reviews per year, per paper. So if you publish, as a first author, if you publish 5 papers in the year, then theoretically you should be able to do 10 to 15 reviews in the year. Otherwise, the system cannot work. Of course, some people only second or third authors, or they never first authors, and they contribute also to the system by reviewing. So it's not as clear-cut as I said, but I would say you can accept 5 to 10 reviews per year. You still have time to do that. You're young, you have plenty of time to do research, but reviewing is a contribution to research. As an editor, I see now that we have 5 editors, I see a little bit less papers, but in the when we were only 4 editors, some years I had 250 papers to look at. Means 5 papers per week. So of course I was not reviewing the papers as my reviewers, but I was still reading the papers and sometimes making notes and so on. And so it takes a lot of time, but it has to be done, and it's part of the fun. So it's nice to see work from other people, from colleagues, and see how the science advances and so on. So I think 5 to 10 reviews per year. It's a good number. That's what most of my colleagues do, and that's what I do. Any other question?
There is one question: how can one become an editor of a journal?
You have to pay. No. It's by accepting reviews, to do reviews. The way I got to become an editor is that I was reviewing for Paleaeocube. I was reviewing quite a lot. And so when the previous editor retired, he was asked who is doing a good job for the journal and who is reviewing a lot for the journal. So he gave names, and Elsevier contacted me, and they said, okay, would you be interested in becoming an editor? And I said, yeah, why not? So if you never review, you can be sure that you will never become an editor. And then if you review for a journal, or for if you also become a well-known scientist, it's good for the journal to have scientists who are well-known on the editorial board. You can also start by being on an editorial board. So for example, in Paleaeocube, we have 5 editors, but we also have an editorial board. And on this editorial board, we put people who also review a lot for us. So it's a kind of reward, and they are put on the editorial board. And of course, when you're on an editorial board, you also ask to review for the journal. And so when we have to find new editors, the first thing we look at is the editorial board. We say, okay, are there people there that we can ask to become an editor? But it's difficult to find editors, actually, because I'll be retiring as editor at the end of the year. And I've been asking colleagues, and basically they all told me, Thierry, you've done a great job. It was really good to have you as editor, but we won't do it. It's too much work. So we will find someone to replace me, probably 2 people, but it's not so easy to find people who are willing to be editors, because it's a heavy workload. But you have to do it. Somebody has to do it, and it's not a dirty job. Anna? Okay. When I'm starting writing a paper, should I already decide particular journal I address it to, or this step may be done further on? As I said, Anna, it's good to probably choose the journal first, because some journals have peculiarities. Some will say they have a limit of words, limit in the number of references, and so on. So you should have at least 1 or 2 journals in mind when you write a paper. Writing a paper and then thinking, okay, I'm going to send it to this journal or this one, it might be okay, but then you might have to rewrite the paper because it's too long. Or so if you write from the start, if you know where you're going to send it, you look at the scope of the journal, you look at the guide to authors, and then you can write your MS accordingly. But of course, some journals have the same requirements, so you can have option of sending it to several journals. Okay, I see there's a question, but I don't see it. Okay, I've seen papers with results and discussion in a single section. Okay, is it okay for Paleaeocube? Yeah, sometimes people join results and discussions. Most of the time, reviewers don't like that. If it's really clear, it can be okay. But most of the time, I would advise you to just separate results and discussion, except if you have very little results, and if you're using results from other people that are already published, it might be okay to just put a single section. But most of the time, if you have a lot of results to present, it's better to separate the 2 sections. Another question? Okay, Constantine, do you think double-blind peer review is going to become industry standard for most journals? Can you think of any reason why this should be a problem? Sounds like a great idea to me. Double-blind peer review. Well, it could become a standard. It really depends. When I review, I always give my name, but I know some people prefer to remain anonymous. Double-blind review. Sometimes, I receive papers and I know who wrote them, who wrote the paper, without looking at the authors. It's getting more and more difficult now because we have more and more people writing papers. But 10 years ago, I was able to at least know some of the authors. If the first author was a young PhD student, of course, it was impossible. But I knew the rest of the authors. So double-blind can be tricky because you can guess sometimes who's the author, but in most cases it could be okay. I have no real opinion about that. I think it has to evolve, and the problem is not so much double-blind review is to find reviewers. Really, I can have double-blind review, but if I don't find reviewers, so you young guys, you have to realize that you have to review papers. Tina, I am curious about the letter to the editor. Okay, I didn't talk about that. I have heard that a good letter that details what you have mentioned in the introduction as important for the letter. How impactful should this letter be so that the paper can be in the publishing pipeline? Okay. The cover letter is important. You have to sell to the editor what's in your article. It shouldn't be too long. Because we don't have time. I mean, I receive about 200 articles per year. So it takes a lot of my time. And if you send me a cover letter, which is 3 pages long, I won't read it. Chances are I won't read it. If it's half a page or maximum a page, I'll take time to read it. And it has to be really a powerful cover letter. I mean, you have to really point out why it's important. Basically, you have to say what's been done before quickly, and what you're bringing. So it's kind of a summary of the introduction, if you want, and why. Also say why my journal is the one that is the good media for it. So a good cover letter is important, but don't make it too long. Frederick, how do you find reviewers? Do you consider suggested reviewers first? It really depends. I have a list of reviewers that I use often, and then I have tools. Now everything is electronic, of course, so I have tools. I can type in keywords, and then it will bring me to Scopus, and in Scopus I will have all the papers published with those keywords, so I can find potential reviewers. I take seriously the reviewers provided by the authors, as long as I can see that they're not friends or co-authors. If you propose co-authors that you had just a few years ago, that's no good. Okay, so if I know that you have worked with this person or you've done a postdoc with this person, it's also no good. I mean, you should try to find reviewers that are completely outside of your circle of friends and people you know well. So I use different ways. I use most of the time I try to use the reviewers that are provided, but I also use Scopus. I look at the authors. So I looked at the authors that have published similar papers in my journal, and I use them. So if you publish a paper in my journal and then 2 months later, sorry, I ask you to review a similar paper and you don't agree, I don't like it because it means that you've generated 2 reviewers and you don't want to review for the journal. That's no good. Okay, so the next time you send a paper, I say, okay, well, he's using the system, but he's not really part of it. Okay, Tamara, you mentioned that the research should be reproducible, but do you publish studies that reproduce results of previous research in your journal? Okay, so when I mean the research should be reproducible, it's basically the method. If you have a new method, it happened to me once. A guy, a colleague, published a method paper, and several people in the same field, including me, we tried his method and it just didn't work. And so I wrote a paper saying, okay, this method doesn't work, and I propose another method, and it's the one that is used now. But if people cannot reproduce your method, that's no good. The results, it's different story. But to reproduce already existing results, well, it means that your work is not really novel, so it will depend. If it's something that is just been found and it's controversial, if you can say, okay, I have results that go in the same direction, it's good. If you send me a copy of Lizicki and Ramo isotopic curve, and you say it agrees, my curve agrees with LR04, I will probably not publish it. Okay, Tamara again. How strict are technical requirements for the paper in Paleocube by word count, number of figures? Well, we try not to publish papers that are too long. And if the number of figures is really too high, we don't have a strict policy. I mean, but if you send me a paper which is 100 pages and 50 figures, I will tell you cut down. It's too long. Nobody will read it. So just make sure that, you know, between 10 and 15 printed pages is a good. Up to 20 printed pages is good. It's already a bit long, 20 pages, but you have to go straight to the point. And if you want people to read your paper, then make sure that it's concise, and that's the best way to do it. Okay, Nick, how often is a MS sent back with major comments because of the artistic quality of figures? That's it can happen. It's getting rarer and rarer because the young generation knows how to handle all the softwares and so on. It was more common in the old days, 10 or 15 years ago, because people would send sometimes handwritten figures, and they were horrible. So now it's not very often that we refuse a paper because of the figures. Sometimes we said, okay, this figure is too crowded, or it's difficult to see it properly. What you have to think about is that the figure usually are reduced on the printed version. So there's less and less prints now. Most papers are on electronic format, and so now we can have the figures in color without paying extra cost and so on. So make sure you make good figures, and if they're readable and so on, usually they're not a case for rejection. Alicia, my question is more related to reviews, but I'm curious that does editor think? I agreed to review a paper looking at the abstract, and it seemed to be related to my expertise. However, after reading the MS, it appeared that it is not related too much. I did my best to review it and made it clear in the letter to editor, but I was wondering, is it possible to resign from reviewing? Is that okay? It's always possible. I mean, you guys are free. When we have someone who agrees to review a paper, normally the abstract is good, and it conveys the idea of the paper, and then you also have the keywords, and then maybe you know the authors. So sometimes what you shouldn't be afraid of is that some papers are partly outside of your field. And sometimes I have reviewers who say, okay, I can review this part of the article, but for example, if you have data and model in an article, some people will say, okay, I can review the data part, but I'm not good with models, so I cannot do that. But so it's still important for us to have those reviews, because then, of course, I will ask a modeler to review the paper as well as a data person. So if you really think you've done it wrong, you accepted a paper, and when you read the paper, you say, okay, this is completely outside of my field, then you can write to the editor and say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It's okay. But read the paper carefully, because most of the time you will be able to contribute a little bit to the discussion and to the reviewing process. Any more questions? Okay, Tina, how can one avoid a discussion section from being too descriptive? Sometimes selling the data means showing the important results. Should one always anchor the discussion section to other published work? Well, except if you find something which is completely novel and nobody has thought about it before, and nobody has talked about it before. Most of the time, your work has been done because you had an idea from reading other papers, and you say, okay, your work is related to something else. So you have to discuss other results. If you don't discuss other results, either it means that you don't know the literature, which is no good, or, as I said, that your work is completely novel, but then you should make this very clear. And I will have trouble finding reviewers, of course, if it's completely novel and nobody has done it before. But, I mean, it can happen. But most of the time, you have to refer to previous work. And if it's completely novel, I think you go for Nature or Science, not for my journal. That's for sure. Tamara, what do you think about tables with raw data in supplementary material, if not too long, as an alternative to dataset? That could be okay. If you don't have too many data, it's okay to publish them in a table and as supplementary material. What's important is that the data are available to the community. So if you have just a few, I mean, you looked at a short core and you have, let's say, 30 levels where you have data, you can put that in a table and as supplementary material, it's okay. My advice is always to try to put your data on in a recognized world database like Pangea or the NOAA, because then some people, when they work, and I'm the first one to do this, when I work in an area, what I do is I go on this site and I download all the data sets that are related to what I'm going to do. And so I can choose the best data set to compare to my work and so on. So if you want to be cited, it's a good way. Put your data on a world database, and then you can be sure that people will download your data and will use it, and your work will be cited. And that's very important, that your work is cited by other people. I mean, you work for the community, so make sure that the data are easily available. Any more questions? Yeah, Tamara. Considering the limits for the reference list, what to do if there is a lot of work done in the field? Go for the most recent publication. You should always go for the original publication. That's a key thing that I didn't talk about. It's true. Because the first person who did something always have to be acknowledged. Then after, you can cite new references. It's also good if you have someone who wrote a review paper. It's good to cite this review paper, but always cite the original reference, and make sure you read, of course, this paper, even if it's an old one. It's always you can always find old papers, but most reviewers, I have some reviewers, and most of them are like that, but I have some very adamant about it. They say, this guy doesn't know the original work. He only read the papers for the last 5 years. He has no knowledge of the real, the first literature about that. So it's important to show your reviewers that you're aware of the previous work, even 20 or 30 years ago, sometimes 50 years ago, and that you're not reinventing the wheel. or at least you think you're reinventing the wheel. Okay, so this is important. Okay. Have you ever dealt with conflict of interest between reviewers and authors? Well, that's a tricky question. Sometimes you don't always know sometimes you know the conflict between two groups. Sometimes authors, when they propose reviewers, they can also tell you, I don't want my paper to be reviewed by this person because we're in conflict. So if they say that, okay, you're not going to use the other person. Sometimes I get authors who said, do not send this paper to, and they cite 10 or 15 people. So that's no good to say that, because it means that you're in conflict with everybody, or you don't want people who really know the field to review your paper. So that's always tricky, and I always have a bad feeling about a paper like that, where when the author asks for a lot of people not to look at the paper. Sometimes I have the paper has a bad review, and the author will tell me, okay, this bad review is probably from this person because we are in conflict. He didn't say in his cover letter that he was in conflict, but then when he gets the bad review, he said, I'm in conflict with this person. I'm sure it's him who reviewed the paper. 90% of the time, it's not the right person. He points out, the author points out. So I disregard that. If it's the real person, then I will ask for an additional reviewer. But most of the time, when I get a very bad review and a good review, I ask for a third review. I make my own opinion, but I see so many papers that sometimes it's out of my field, and I usually ask for a third review. And then Tina, for review papers, what are some of the must-do? Okay, well, review papers, they're very important. To give you an example, I was asked, before I became an editor, I was asked by Paleocube to write a review paper in my field, coral work and tropical paleoclimatology. And I was a bit reluctant. I thought, well, review paper, another one, is it really important, and so on. And I published this paper in 2006, and it's the most cited paper I have so far. I think it's been cited more than 200 times, and it's still cited every year, quite a lot. So review papers are important for your career. If you want to write a review paper, first you should write to the editor and propose the review paper. There are some journals that specialize in a review paper, Earth Science Reviews, for example. So you can write to the editor, but most of the time, write to the editor and propose a review, and the editor will see if it's interesting or not, and then it will propose you to do a review or not. And if you do a review paper, then you have to look at all the papers that have been published in this review, in this topic, and then you have to make choices. You have to highlight the important things. You have to have a clear view of how it evolved, the field evolved, and how it should go in the future. So the review paper is tricky to write. It's probably more, I would say, for young scientists, it's not so good. I would say until you have at least 10, 15 years of practice in science, writing a review paper would be a bit too tricky, except if you wrote a review for your thesis and you think it's publishable, then you can propose that to an editor. But it's a tricky paper to write, much more difficult than normal papers. And so it's the kind of papers you can write after probably when you're a seasoned scientist. Constantin, imagine you published a sediment core in lower resolution and have now generated a higher resolution core with more proxies and updated interpretation. You obviously would cite your own paper. Okay, the question is, would you submit to the same journal or try another one instead? Asking for a friend. Okay, well, you can publish in the same journal. I have no problem with that, as long as what the additional data really tell you a different story. If it's just, I mean, if you have a core with weighting data every 10 centimeters, and then you generate weighting data every centimeter, if it doesn't change the story, the basic story, then you will never find a place to publish it. But if it really changes the story, and if it's different output, then you can send it to the same journal. And in your cover letter, you should be very clear about what the new analysis added in terms of scientific rationale. Why did you do it, and the importance of this new data in terms of a different story. But no problem to try the same journal.
Are there any more questions? If not, I would thank Tierre Correge.
Thank you for inviting me.